Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, November 12th, 1982, a multi-day ceremony is taking place in Washington, D.C. to dedicate the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, built in honor of service members who fought and those Americans who died in the war in Vietnam. The central feature of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the element that was opened at that ceremony in 1982, is the memorial wall, 2 enormous black granite slabs set into the ground, sitting in a sort of V formation, engraved with the names of those who died in the war. The wall initially listed 57,939 names. In the decades since, another 500 or so have been added to that list, as have some other elements to the memorial space. This is a site that has seen some controversy and some attempts to address that controversy over the years, and I guess address some of the bigger questions about how we memorialize our war dead. So here to talk about the Vietnam Memorial and those larger questions is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hey, Jody.
You seen it in person?
I have. I think I saw it for the first time in 2006 when I was living in Washington for a few months, and I knew the controversy, and so I didn't expect much from the memorial, and I was actually pretty moved by it.
Yeah, I mean, I went to high school in D.C., and I went down to play sports in along the mall a lot, and so I walked past it a lot, and so, you know, I've been to it a bunch, and I kind of feel like it was the first piece of architecture that really moved me. I mean, it is incredibly moving, and I remember also hearing, I think maybe after the fact, that its design was controversial and not really getting it, which I think it says something about things that are controversial. Often after time, you forget why they were actually controversial. But I just find it, I find it incredibly moving. I find it to tell the story that I think we need to tell about war and what it does to us. But yes, if you have not been, I would highly recommend going and spending some time on the grounds. So do you want to talk a little bit about the controversy? And the controversy really was about what I described, which is this very stoic, very serene, black granite V-shaped wall with the names of the Americans who died in the war.
Yeah, well, think about the kinds of war memorials we're used to seeing, like raising the flag at Iwo Jima, these very triumphant, powerful, right, figural, they have real people in them, images that seem to glorify and celebrate the war. And this war memorial is not like that. And I think that it played into the reason it was controversial was because there was a real resentment among some Americans that people seemed ashamed of the Vietnam War, and they didn't seem celebratory of it. And they seemed to not want to really win the war, right? This was very popular opinion among conservatives that the U.S. did not fully commit to the war in Vietnam. They never wanted to win it, and they never properly celebrated the soldiers who had fought it. And so all of those resentments and all of that concern that the U.S. had been beaten by the Vietnam War, that there was no longer a sense of pride in the nation's military and national power, all of those resentments and controversies get larded on to this one memorial.
Right, which I suppose, that's the point of a memorial. It is supposed to capture, the kind of depth of what happens when a country goes to war. And so, I mean, in a weird way, it sort of did that. But, some of the critics of the design called it nihilistic, a nihilistic slab of stone, which my response would be like, well, this war is pretty nihilistic. But there was even attempts to block the permit from building it in the first place. It eventually did go forward and get built. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the designer, Maya Lin, who I think, to me, again, I grew up in D.C., and this was one of the first pieces of architecture that I kind of thought about, but she was certainly the first architect whose name I ever knew. What do we need to know about Maya Lin?
She's amazing. She was, at the time, an undergraduate at Yale University. She's the daughter of Chinese immigrants. And there had been this competition over who would design the memorial. And she submitted her proposal, which she had also submitted in class and gotten a B on. And she won this competition for the design, beating out, by the way, her professor who gave her the B and also submitted a design. And so she was obviously like a new artist and architect, but this college student was the one who gave us this amazing memorial.
Yeah. And, daughter of Chinese immigrants. I think her story is an American story in many really kind of fascinating and inspiring ways. I did mention in the intro how, in part because of the controversy over the main memorial wall, there have been some additions over the years. Let's go through a few of those because I think they're interesting in terms of how we've told the story of the Vietnam War to ourselves. The first one is a proper kind of statue called The Three Soldiers was added. And initially I read that there were attempts to say that this would sit at the sort of middle of the V and be the kind of centerpiece. And Maya Lin objected really strongly to that because she wanted the quality of the memorial to be a space in which you sit and be reflective and see these names. And she didn't really want something that would be a central focus to the memorial. She wanted it to be a reflective space. What do we need to know about the Three Soldiers statue that was added, a few years later?
So this is a more traditional kind of war monument in the sense that it depicts soldiers. In this case, it depicts a white soldier, an African-American soldier, and a Latino-American soldier. And I think that diversity is actually really important. It's something that the U.S. has actually celebrated a lot in its war memorials, this idea that the United States is a multi-ethnic nation and war is a forge through which we're all brought together. And that's something that this monument was trying to do as well, was trying to say, look, it's Black people fighting by white people, fighting by Latino people, and we're all in this together, and this is how we all become united as Americans.
Yeah. The next element that was added was what's known as the Women's Memorial. I think in the initial list of names of people who died, I read there were only like 8 or so women on the entire wall. And so now there is in 1993, a Vietnam Women's Memorial that was dedicated.
I mean, the way that women are memorialized in war is actually a really fascinating question because they're not necessarily always in memoriam because they're not on the front lines and they die at a much lower rate because of that. So how to recognize their service and the inclusion of them here, though late, was an important recognition of all the people who it takes to carry out a war.
Yeah, and to that end, another part of war that we kind of maybe don't focus on and really understand is the aftermath of it. And to that end, in 2000, then what's known as the memorial plaque was added to this space. And that was a plaque that is there to honor the people who, after the war, continued to struggle, from injuries and from psychological fallout and so forth. And I think that probably brings us maybe full circle back to what you were talking about at the beginning about how a lot of the controversy about this memorial was about how we dealt with the aftermath of the war. Not even necessarily the war itself, which was controversial, but just our inability to really settle and reckon with the aftermath of the war, and in many ways, the actual returning veterans to this country. And this brings up so many of those really fraught questions.
And dealing with things like not just Agent Orange and the way that U.S. waging of war harmed the soldiers themselves in that sort of chemical sense, but also the mental toll that it took on so many people. This is something that has been talked about in terms of war for a really long time. We talked about people coming back from World War I shell-shocked. But when it came to Vietnam War veterans coming back, this is actually really good literature, and treatment for PTSD starts to develop after this as a way of treating these soldiers. But there wasn't necessarily the same kind of effort to not just celebrate the soldiers, because it's complicated in terms of celebrating war, but knitting people back into the body politic when they come home is something that the U.S. didn't do a great job of when it came to the Vietnam War.
Sure. And it even gets to, maybe we'll do an episode specifically about this, but these larger questions and narratives about how Vietnam War veterans were treated when they came back. You know, there's lots of urban legends about Vietnam War veterans getting spat on. I think there's been some reporting that shows that those incidents were maybe overplayed. But certainly, I think a lot of people's uneasiness with the war itself was glommed onto how we treated individual veterans when they got back. And I think a lot of people correctly make the point that the focus on individual interactions between Americans and veterans papers over this larger question of how did our government and how did our society deal with the aftermath of the war and help people or not help people as they were coming back and trying to reintegrate and dealing with the aftermath of the war that we sent them to.
And a war that was unpopular at the time. I mean, I'm thinking about this through the lens of my dad, who was drafted and ended up fighting in Vietnam. It wasn't a war that he wanted to fight. And there were so many other people who weren't drafted and were protected from being drafted. And so this idea that you're going fighting a war that you're not, doesn't seem like people are super into, that you don't want to be part of. And then you come home with all of this trauma and you have to somehow knit yourself back in. And there aren't like big victory parades being held all over town celebrating you.
Yeah. And again, that's why I feel like the nature of the memorial itself, I think, is so powerful, because it just creates a space in which all of that complexity can live. Mm-hmm. It is not, as you said, super patriotic and over the top. It is also, I don't think, nihilistic. I think it is a memorial. It honors what happened, and when you go there and you see the way people interact with the memorial, the most notable one is that people go and they do what's called rubbing. They take a piece of paper and they find a name of someone in their family or someone they knew, and they'll pass a piece of chalk on a piece of paper over the engraving and take a stencil of that name. But there are, there's flowers, there's flags. It is this mix of patriotism, solemnity, reflection, and all those things that you want in that space. As we wrap up, I want, inevitably I've been thinking about war and kind of memorializing war, and it is notable, right, that we are now in the longest war we've ever fought, what is often referred to as forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There are not formal memorials because that war has not formally ended. And so I wonder if you think kind of how do we deal with memorials in the era of forever wars?
It's a really complicated question. One, because as you know, the wars don't end, but they're intensely unpopular. And so what is it that the country wants to say via its memorials and monuments about these wars that it's been involved in that don't have a ton of public backing? I mean, typically what you would expect is actually what you see with the Vietnam Memorial, a focus on the men and women who fight the wars rather than the wars themselves. So we would probably anticipate seeing more of that, but there will be so much controversy around it because the way we talk about wars, and this was true in Vietnam, but is to also focus on the lives taken on the other side and the millions of people who have died as a result of these wars who aren't Americans. And so how do we tell this big, complicated story? It's hard. And even when it came to World War II, there was a big controversy in the 1990s over how to memorialize the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped a nuclear bomb. At the end of the day, the people who were putting together the display basically were like, let's let the plane speak for itself because we can't agree on what the message should be. So I think we might be in for some more of those long, difficult conversations.
And just to add a couple little facts here, I mean, there are efforts and there is talk of memorials around the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's also efforts to do memorials around Desert Storm, the first Iraq war, which there isn't a formal one, but I think there are some formal efforts to do it on the National Mall in D.C. I think I read that the rule of thumb is sort of 10 years after a war ends is when the memorialization starts to go in. So again, when you have a war that doesn't end and you're fighting lots of wars and spreading wars, this is a new kind of war. If that's even the right word. And so I think it brings up these interesting questions about how we memorialize it and reckon with it. All right, let's leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. If you have any questions or comments about the show, email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. We really appreciate all the questions and comments and emails we get. We also appreciate all the ratings and reviews people leave on your podcast player of choice, so keep throwing those out there. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.